Howdy ESSM 406. In this video I'd like to introduce some of the main overarching themes of Unit 3.2. As I'm sure you're aware, there's three parts of the third unit of this class, Unit 3.1 and Unit 3.2. The reason I've split this up like this is that there's a lot of different kinds of potential policy tools we might use to solve environmental problems. And they tend to be discussed in very different ways. So in Unit 3.1, we discussed government regulations, prescriptive regulation, or command and control regulation, all terms for basically the same thing. And then we discussed market-based solutions, including property rights, taxes, subsidies, and these cap-and-trade programs. And these all have a lot in common. Specifically, they're all premised on the assumption that the government is going to do something to solve the problem. Now, what the government does is quite different in the case of a prescriptive regulation, or a tax, or establishing a property right, or creating a cap-and-trade program. And traditionally, people on what in the US we call the left of the political spectrum, traditionally Democratic Party, have been more in favor of things like government regulation. And traditionally people on the right have been more in favor of market-based solutions. But they're actually both premised on the idea that the government should do something. And I think I've warned you in some of my past lectures that you need to be a little careful about accepting these political labels as sort of a gospel truth about the way the world is, because they can be a little misleading. And there's some things that neither party really emphasize. There's other ways of thinking about these problems. So now we're going to start talking about some of those other ways. And I titled this unit Communities and Collaboration. It brings together a bunch of different ideas, not all of which are closely related. But the basic idea is that it's not always necessary for the government to solve the problem for the people. Sometimes people can solve the problem on their own. Now, governments are one of the ways we solve problems collectively, but sometimes we can solve problems at a more local scale without asking the national government or the state government of Texas to solve the problem for us. Some of you are studying problems that are about cities, and cities are a more local form of government. And if you're studying San Antonio or Houston, you might say, well, it's still really big. But if you're studying a smaller community, a smaller region, say you're studying a community that lives in the wildland-urban interface, or a small city's water system, it looks a little bit less like what we think of as kind of government being this big thing that's distant from people. And sometimes it's not even government that's doing things. Sometimes it's just citizens organizing together, working together to create their own solutions to local problems. And you'll read some examples of this in some of the articles I've given you by Arun Agrawal, Elinor Ostrom, Sable, Fung, and Karkenian, and Andres and Jansen. So all of those articles talk about different ways in which local people are organizing. Now, it's important to understand that this organizing doesn't always happen because there's no government. It's not always an alternative to government involvement. In fact, in some cases, it's brought about by government involvement. Sometimes the government mandates that a change happen, so there may be a command and control, a prescriptive regulation, but the way that we deal with that is by some sort of a community-level collaboration. So these aren't oppositions, they're different ways of solving problems. And finally, I've given you a couple articles about different ways to actually bring collaboration about, to make decisions in situations of conflict. And these are the articles by Innes and Boer and Gregory. I was actually trying to get Innes to come and give a talk to our department earlier this fall. Unfortunately, she's older. She didn't want to travel. She lives out in California, and for her that was a long trip. So we didn't get her to come visit us, but we can get some benefit from her ideas here about how we can make collaboration work better. So in the next videos, I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into some of these examples and what they illustrate, and talk a little bit about some of these strategies.